The romanticized paintings of Civil War battles, with their neat rows of soldiers and gallant charges, mask a brutal truth. The conflict was a meat grinder that would have likely ended your life in ways too horrific for most history books to detail. The war's primitive medical care, coupled with devastatingly modern weapons, created a perfect storm of lethality that killed over 620,000 Americans, a death toll that would equal 6 million in today's population terms. As Walt Whitman, who served as a volunteer nurse, wrote in his diary, "The real war will never get in the books. Its interior history will not only never be written, but can never be written." The battlefields of 1861 were theaters of unprecedented carnage, where antiquated Napoleonic tactics met the destructive power of industrial weaponry. Imagine yourself shoulder to shoulder with other soldiers, advancing in tight formations directly into concentrated fire. The widespread adoption of the mini ball, a conical bullet that expanded upon impact, turned every shot into a potential catastrophe. These bullets didn't just pierce flesh, they shattered bones into fragments, drove clothing fibers deep into wounds, and created injuries that would make modern trauma surgeons shudder. At Gettysburg alone, over 27,000 mini-balls were recovered from a single acre of ground, giving horrifying testimony to the intensity of fire that soldiers faced. "I have never seen such mangling of human flesh," wrote Confederate surgeon Julian John Chisholm after treating victims of these devastating projectiles. At the Battle of Shiloh, the fighting was so intense that soldiers reported bullets striking their equipment with such frequency that it sounded like hail on a tin roof. The miniature ball's impact often pulverized bones beyond any hope of repair, particularly in limb wounds. When these bullets struck a soldier's arm or leg, they didn't just break bones, they exploded them into dozens of pieces, leaving surgeons with no choice but amputation. Private William Ostrander of the 24th Michigan wrote home, "The sounds of the bullets striking the men was sickening, like throwing a handful of corn against a barn door." Speaking of surgery, forget everything you know about modern medical care. Civil War hospitals were more akin to butcher shops than medical facilities. At the Battle of Antietam, Union surgeon Jonathan Letterman described the scene at his field hospital. The ground was literally covered with men. Their wounds were of the most frightful character. Surgeons worked assembly line style, moving from patient to patient with barely a moment to clean their instruments. The speed was necessary. There were simply too many wounded to treat carefully. One surgeon at Gettysburg reported performing 76 amputations in a single day. These operations were often performed without anesthesia, with soldiers held down by their comrades as the saw did its work. The lucky ones got a shot of whiskey or a quick gulp of chloroform. Mary Chestnut, a Confederate diarist, described visiting a hospital in Richmond. "The surgeons are sawing off arms and legs as fast as they can. The screams of the wounded under the knife are heartbreaking." The brutality of close-quarter combat would have been especially shocking to modern sensibilities. At the Battle of Cold Harbor, soldiers engaged in savage hand-to-hand combat using bayonets, rifle butts, and even their bare hands. "We fought them with clubbed muskets," recalled one survivor, "and when they were too close even for that, we grabbed them by the throats." During the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864, the dense vegetation forced soldiers to fight at point-blank range, often unable to see their opponents until they were just feet away. Colonel Charles S. Wainwright described the fighting as more like a great street fight than a battle. The horrific nature of bayonet combat was such that soldiers often wrote about preferring to be shot than stabbed, considering it a more honorable death. Even if you survived the initial wound, infection was likely to finish you off. Without antibiotics, even minor injuries could turn fatal. The story of General John Reynolds, who died at Gettysburg from what today would be considered a relatively minor wound, illustrates this reality. Gangrene was particularly feared, its distinctive sweet-rotting smell becoming all too familiar in field hospitals. Clara Barton, who later founded the American Red Cross, described the smell as so strong it could be detected from outside the hospital tent. Surgeons often identified gangrene cases by smell alone, knowing that delay meant certain death. The only treatment was aggressive amputation, cutting far above the infected area in hopes of getting ahead of the spreading poison. Dr. Hunter McGuire, Stonewall Jackson's personal physician, noted that the smell of gangrene hung about the hospital like a shroud. The psychological trauma, though less visible than physical wounds, was equally devastating. Soldiers witnessed their friends literally torn apart beside them, collected body parts after battles, and lived with the constant awareness of their own mortality. "The sight was horrible," wrote Lieutenant Thomas Galway after Gettysburg. "Limbless trunks, heads without bodies, and bodies without heads." Sullivan Ballew's famous letter to his wife Sarah, written just before his death at Bull Run, captures the emotional toll. "But oh Sarah, if the dead can come back to this earth, I shall always be near you, in the garish day and in the darkest night, always, always." The war's industrial nature meant that death could come from increasingly impersonal sources. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, Union soldiers advancing across open ground toward Mary's Heights faced such devastating artillery fire that Confederate General James Longstreet remarked, "A chicken could not live on that field." Artillery shells, particularly case shot and canister, could turn entire formations into red mist. At Antietam, Confederate artillery unleashed such devastation that one Union soldier described the aftermath as a slaughter pen. Bodies were often so mangled that identification became impossible, leading to the war's first widespread use of dog tags. After the Battle of Gettysburg, a farmer found his field so littered with body parts that he gathered them in a sack for burial, unable to match limbs to their owners. Those who survived severe wounds faced a lifetime of disability in an era before effective prosthetics or rehabilitation programs. The case of Private Alfred Bellard of the 5th New Jersey Infantry provides a stark example. After losing his leg at Chancellorsville, he spent the rest of his life struggling with a crude wooden replacement that frequently caused painful sores. Veterans with amputated limbs had to adapt to crude wooden replacements, while those with internal injuries often suffered chronic pain without effective treatment options. James Longstreet's soldier, Richard Kirkland, known as the Angel of Mary's Heights for giving water to wounded Union soldiers, himself survived the war only to suffer chronic pain from multiple wounds until his death years later. The Civil War's mortality rate was staggering. Approximately 1 in 5 young Southern white men died during the conflict. In the North, the death rate was only slightly lower. These statistics don't merely represent numbers. They represent agonizing individual deaths, each one marked by suffering that modern medicine would consider unconscionable. The war's brutality was so complete that soldiers often carried fatal pills, preferring a quick death to the possibility of a slow, agonizing end in a field hospital. As Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who survived 3 near-fatal wounds during the war, later wrote, "In our youth, our hearts were touched with fire." In an era before dog tags became standard issue, many soldiers pinned notes with their names and home addresses to their uniforms before battle, hoping their families could at least be notified of their fate. At Gettysburg, a dead soldier was found with a simple note pinned to his jacket. "Dear Father, forgive me for running away to join the army. I hope I've made you proud." This poignant detail perhaps best illustrates the soldier's resignation to the likelihood of death, and not just any death, but one marked by suffering that we, with our modern sensibilities and medical capabilities, can scarcely comprehend. As Abraham Lincoln noted in his second inaugural address, reflecting on the war's toll, "The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. Hunger, pestilence, and devastation, the silent killers of America's Civil War." While bullets and bayonets claimed their share of lives during the Civil War, an equally merciless enemy stalked both armies and civilians alike. The devastating combination of starvation, disease, and environmental destruction. The romantic notions of glory and honor quickly dissolved in the face of empty stomachs, festering camps, and the methodical destruction of the American countryside. As Confederate soldier John S. Wise recalled, "Death by glory was preferable to death by sickness, starvation, or the wasting of prison life." The daily survival of a Civil War soldier often hinged on their ability to stomach what passed for food. The standard military ration of hardtack, a dense brick-like cracker, frequently arrived riddled with weevils and maggots. At the Siege of Petersburg, soldiers from the 14th Connecticut Infantry developed a dark humor about their provisions, holding worm races with the insects they found in their hardtack. Soldiers darkly joked that their crackers could march better than they could, thanks to the insects that had taken up residence within. As one Union soldier wrote in his diary, "The worms float to the surface when you pour coffee over your hardtack. At least then you can skim them off." Private Robert Ransom of the 9th Virginia Infantry noted, "We called them animated hardtack and tried to convince ourselves that the extra meat was good for us." Salt pork, another staple of military diet, often arrived in various states of decomposition. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, Union soldiers reportedly used their rancid pork rations as fuel for fires, finding them too spoiled to eat but sufficiently greasy to burn. Soldiers developed a grim ritual of cutting away the green and blackened portions of meat, hoping to find something edible underneath. When Confederate General John B. Gordon's men captured a Union supply train near Cold Harbor in 1864, they discovered barrels of pork so rancid that even starving soldiers couldn't stomach it. One Confederate soldier wrote home, "We ate all our shoes last week, and yesterday the boys were asking how mule meat might taste." At Vicksburg, besieged Confederate soldiers actually did resort to eating mules, rats, and even shoe leather. General Pemberton's chief of staff reported that mule meat sold for $1 a pound and rats became a delicacy. The situation grew even more desperate as the war progressed and supply lines became targets. By 1863, Confederate soldiers were receiving only a quarter pound of meat per day, when they received any at all. The Confederate blockade runners could only bring in a fraction of needed supplies, while Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's infamous March to the Sea deliberately targeted the Confederate food supply. His 60,000-man army cut a path of destruction 60 miles wide through Georgia, destroying everything that could sustain an army or civilian population. Private George Sharland of Sherman's army wrote, "We destroyed everything we could not eat. The country behind us was a desert. A crow would have to carry its own rations to fly over it." Sherman's philosophy was simple and brutal. War is cruelty. There is no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over. His men destroyed over 300 miles of railroad tracks, bending heated rails around trees in what became known as Sherman's neckties. The civilian population, particularly in the South, faced their own nightmare of survival. In Atlanta, before Sherman's arrival, a barrel of flour cost $1,000 in Confederate currency. Mary Chestnut, a prominent Southern diarist, described how Confederate women were reduced to making coffee from burnt corn and tea from blackberry leaves. She wrote, "We are learning to live without everything except bread, and not much of that." In Richmond, the Confederate capital, food riots broke out in April 1863 as inflation made basic staples unaffordable for most citizens. 1 pound of butter cost $27 in Confederate currency, more than a week's wages for many workers. The riot, led primarily by women, only ended when Jefferson Davis himself appeared and threw his pocket change to the crowd, promising to help but also threatening to order soldiers to fire upon them. Disease proved an even more efficient killer than starvation. Camp life was a perfect breeding ground for epidemics, with thousands of men crowded together in appalling sanitary conditions. At Camp Douglas in Chicago, nicknamed the North's Andersonville, Confederate prisoners were packed so tightly that disease spread like wildfire. The stench of army camps was so overwhelming that soldiers claimed they could smell their own army from miles away. Union General Benjamin Butler noted that he could track Confederate movements by following the visible miasma that hung over their camps. At Andersonville Prison, the infamous Confederate POW camp, up to 100 men died daily from a combination of diseases, with dysentery being particularly lethal. Survivor Robert H. Kellogg described the scene. "In the morning, the dead were found in their places, as they had fallen asleep forever, There was no room even to lay down without lying on someone. The prison's stream, which served as both water source and latrine, became so polluted that merely drinking from it could be a death sentence. Typhoid fever, dubbed camp fever by soldiers, spread rapidly through both armies. The disease killed more men than combat in the war's first year. During the Peninsular Campaign of 1862, the Union Army of the Potomac reported over 5,000 cases of typhoid fever in a single month. Private William Christie of the 1st Minnesota Infantry described the progression. First comes the fever and aching, then the bloody flux, and if you're unlucky enough to survive that, the pneumonia finishes you off. At the Battle of Shiloh, so many soldiers were sick with typhoid that General Grant's army was nearly defeated before reinforcements arrived. Even those who recovered often remained weakened and susceptible to other illnesses. General George McClellan himself was incapacitated by typhoid for several weeks, potentially affecting the early conduct of the war. The medical knowledge of the era offered little defense against these microscopic enemies. At Washington's Armory Square Hospital, pioneering nurse Clara Barton observed that for every soldier who died in battle, 2 died of disease. Doctors, still unaware of germ theory, often spread diseases by moving from patient to patient without washing their hands. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, who revolutionized battlefield medicine, wrote despairingly, "We lose more men to invisible enemies than to rebel bullets." When smallpox broke out in Washington, D.C. in 1862, the primitive vaccination methods sometimes caused more deaths than the disease itself. Union surgeon Charles Tripler reported that in some cases, the cure proved worse than the disease. In one tragic instance at Camp Nelson, Kentucky, an entire regiment of United States colored troops was decimated by a contaminated batch of smallpox vaccine. The environment itself became toxic as armies moved through areas. The aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg left over 7,000 dead horses and mules rotting in the summer heat, contaminating local water supplies. Unburied bodies contaminated water sources, while the massive concentration of men and animals turned camps into cesspools. Local farmer Samuel McCreary recorded that the stench was so powerful it woke us from sleep at night. After the Battle of Gettysburg, the stench of decay was so strong that residents reported being able to smell the battlefield from 30 miles away. In his diary, Lieutenant Frank Haskell wrote, "The air grew heavy with 1,000 putrefactions. I wish I could forget that smell." One farmer wrote that his cattle refused to drink from streams for months after armies had passed through, and crops planted the following spring failed to grow in soil saturated with human and animal remains. Personal hygiene became an impossible luxury in these conditions. Union soldier John Billings described in his memoir Hardtack and Coffee how men would go months without changing clothes, leading to skin diseases so severe that some soldiers' backs looked like plowed fields. Soldiers went weeks or months without changing clothes or bathing. Lice were so common that men held shirt-reading sessions where they would examine their clothing seams for parasites while sharing news and gossip. Confederate Private Sam Watkins wrote, "The lice were the size of grains of corn and were regular graybacks. We named them after our officers." One Union soldier wrote home, "If the lice were uniform in size and well-drilled, they could pull a man out of the trenches." At Andersonville Prison, inmates became so infested that guards could hear the constant scratching of prisoners at night. The desperate measures taken for survival often led to tragic consequences. In Richmond, the Tredegar Iron Works continued operating through the war, but its workers were so malnourished that accident rates soared. One worker noted, "Men faint at their stations, but we dare not stop the machines." In the countryside, people resorted to eating bark bread, made from tree bark mixed with small amounts of meal, and coffee, made from dried sweet potatoes. Martha Ballard, a plantation owner's wife, recorded how her family survived on soup made from boiled leather belts and shoe tops. "We pretend it is beef broth, but we fool no one, least of all our stomachs." The collapse of basic sanitation infrastructure had ripple effects throughout society. In Memphis, the breakdown of waste management systems led to a cholera outbreak that killed hundreds in 1866, well after the war's end. Union surgeon Samuel Stout observed, "We defeated the Confederacy, but the filth and disease of war may yet defeat us all." The war's aftermath saw a dramatic increase in tuberculosis cases, as weakened immune systems and crowded refugee conditions created perfect conditions for the disease's spread. The war's end brought little immediate relief to the suffering. Mary Boykin Chestnut made a final entry in her famous diary in 1865. First moved from terror of the Yankees, then of the Africans, then of starvation, and now of extermination. Federal surgeon Charles Black, surveying the post-war South, reported, "The people here are not just defeated, they are decimated. Disease, malnutrition, and despair have done what bullets could not." Indeed, the true toll of the war's environmental and health impact would not be fully understood for decades, as subsequent generations continued to suffer from the long-term effects of environmental destruction, compromised public health systems, and generational malnutrition. The Civil War thus stands as not just a military conflict, but as America's first modern environmental and public health catastrophe. As Frederick Law Olmsted, who served with the U.S. Sanitary Commission, observed in 1866, "We have learned at terrible cost that armies can be destroyed without battles, and that the health of civilians is as strategic a concern as any military objective." The war's legacy of disease, starvation, and environmental devastation would influence American public health policy and military planning for generations to come. Beyond Hell's Gates, the horrific reality of Civil War prison camps. The American Civil War's prison camps stand as testament to humanity's capacity for both survival and cruelty. Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon grimly acknowledged, "It is a harsh necessity of war, but necessity nonetheless, that prisoners must suffer." While battlefields claimed their share of victims, the true horrors of the war often played out behind the walls and stockades of prisoner-of-war camps, where survival became a daily struggle against starvation, disease, and despair. As one Union survivor wrote, "Those who died by the bullet were the lucky ones." Andersonville Prison, officially known as Camp Sumter, became the most notorious symbol of POW suffering. Captain Henry Wirtz, the Swiss-born Confederate commander of the camp, would later become the only person executed for war crimes during the Civil War. Designed to hold 10,000 prisoners, by August 1864, it crammed more than 32,000 Union soldiers into just 26.5 acres of open ground. The death rate reached a staggering 100 men per day during the summer months. Dorrance Atwater, a young Union soldier who worked in the prison hospital, secretly kept a list of the dead that would later become crucial evidence in Wirtz's trial. One survivor, Private Robert Henderson Kellogg, wrote, "In the morning, the dead were found in their places, as they had fallen asleep forever, many times stepping over the dead bodies as if they were logs." Dr. Joseph Jones, a Confederate surgeon who inspected the camp, reported, "I found the prisoners in all stages of suffering and disease, many lying in their own filth, too weak to move. The camp's infamous deadline, a simple wooden rail set about 19 feet from the stockade wall, became a killing zone where guards would shoot any prisoner who crossed or even touched it." Private James Madison Tracy, of the 82nd New York Infantry, recorded how guard James Duncan boasted of killing 31 Yankees in a single month at the deadline. Some desperate men, driven mad by conditions, deliberately crossed this line, seeking a quick death rather than slow starvation. Sergeant William Corbett of the 68th New York Infantry recorded in his diary, "Today I watched 3 men walk deliberately to the deadline. They were shot down like dogs, and their bodies left to rot where they fell." During one particularly harsh week in July 1864, guards reported using over 200 rounds of ammunition on deadline violators. The notorious stream that ran through Andersonville, dubbed Sweetwater Branch in bitter irony, served as both water source and open sewer. Sergeant Augustus P. Sherman described it as a mere ribbon of human excrement. Diarrhea and dysentery became so prevalent that prisoners called it the bowel complaint. Union Private John Ransom wrote in his diary, The stream is a mass of moving maggots, yet men fight for the privilege of drinking from it. The stream banks became a nightmare of human waste and disease, with weakened men often falling in and drowning in mere inches of water, too feeble to pull themselves out. Dr. John C. Bates, a surviving Union surgeon, estimated that 1 in 3 deaths at Andersonville could be traced directly to waterborne diseases from this stream. Northern prisons, while generally better supplied, had their own horrors. Chicago's Camp Douglas, nicknamed the North's Andersonville, saw Confederate prisoners forced to sleep in rat-infested underground chambers during brutal Midwest winters. Colonel Charles V. DeLand, the camp commandant, instituted a policy of retaliation in kind, deliberately reducing rations when news arrived of Southern mistreatment of Union prisoners. At Point Lookout, Maryland, where over 50,000 Confederate prisoners passed through during the war, prisoners were subjected to deliberate food deprivation as retaliation for the treatment of Union soldiers in Southern camps. Lieutenant Robert E. Park of the 12th Alabama Infantry recorded, "The Yankee guards amuse themselves by shooting into our tents at night." One Confederate prisoner wrote home, "We are fed like hogs and treated like dogs." Captain Joseph Jones noted that the death rate at Point Lookout reached 28% during the winter of 1864. The psychological torture was often as devastating as the physical deprivation. At Elmira Prison in New York, nicknamed Hellmira by its 12,000 Confederate inmates, guards would sometimes display fresh bread just outside prisoner reach, watching as starving men fought each other for crumbs that fell from the loaves. Colonel Benjamin Tracy, the camp commander, justified such practices as necessary discipline. Private Henry Clay Trumbull described how guards would throw food into the compound as if feeding animals in a menagerie. The camp's death rate of 24% nearly matched Andersonville's, with over 2,900 prisoners dying from exposure, disease, and malnutrition. Prisoner John Futch wrote in his diary, "Today, I saw a man trade his gold wedding ring for a moldy piece of cornbread." The desperate search for food led to unthinkable scenarios. At Andersonville, rumors of cannibalism emerged when prisoners began disappearing, only to be found partially consumed. Sergeant Major Robert H. Kellogg testified about finding half-eaten bodies in the swamps near the stockade. While never officially confirmed, survivor accounts speak of a gang known as the Raiders who may have resorted to this ultimate taboo. John McElroy, in his memoir Andersonville, A Story of Rebel Military Prisons, wrote carefully around the subject, noting only that some things are too horrible to commit to paper. Confederate guard James Barrett reported finding human bones with teeth marks during his patrols, though official records dismissed these accounts as products of deranged minds. Escape attempts, while numerous, rarely succeeded. The Confederate prison at Salisbury, North Carolina, employed packs of bloodhounds specifically trained to track escapees. Master handler John H. Sears boasted that his dogs could smell a Yankee a mile away. These dogs were so effective that the mere sound of their baying would send prisoners scrambling back to their compounds. At Florence Stockade in South Carolina, guard James Connor documented 328 escape attempts in a single month, with only 2 successful getaways. Those caught faced brutal punishment. At Virginia's Belle Isle Prison, failed escapees were tied to posts and left exposed to the elements for days. Lieutenant James M. Carrington described watching a recaptured prisoner freeze to death after being tied to a post for 48 hours in January 1864. The methods of preventing escape grew increasingly cruel as the war progressed. At Georgia's Camp Lawton, Commandant Captain D.W. Vowles instituted the running gauntlet, where recaptured prisoners were forced to run between 2 lines of guards who beat them with rifle butts and bayonets. Lieutenant Ezra Ripple documented one such punishment, where a young private from Ohio died after being forced to run the gauntlet 3 times. At Camp Ford in Texas, guards would place captured escapees in sweat boxes, tiny wooden structures where prisoners would be confined for days in the scorching heat. Some camps implemented a one-escape, all-punish policy, where entire sections would be denied food if a single prisoner attempted escape. Captain Henry Wirtz at Andersonville justified this practice in a letter to Richmond, writing, "Fear of their fellow prisoners' revenge is our strongest wall." The social structure within the camps devolved into a brutal hierarchy. At Andersonville, a gang of prisoners known as the Raiders, led by the notorious Charles Curtis, terrorized their fellow inmates, stealing food and belongings, sometimes murdering weaker prisoners for their rations. William Silver Jim Gray, one of Curtis's lieutenants, was known for wearing rings made from the bones of his victims. The situation became so dire that camp authorities eventually allowed a group of prisoners, called the Regulators, led by Sergeant William Collins, to hold trials and execute the worst offenders. 6 raiders were hanged on July 11, 1864, with their fellow prisoners cheering the executions. Private John Ransom recorded in his diary, "Even in this hell, we found worse devils among our own." The torture methods employed in some camps went beyond mere neglect. At Castle Thunder in Richmond, Commandant Captain George W. Alexander was notorious for his creative punishments. Prisoners were subjected to bucking and gagging, being tied in a painful position for hours or days. Lieutenant William Howard testified about a practice called barrel riding, where prisoners were forced to sit astride sharp-edged barrels for hours, often resulting in severe internal injuries. Some guards at multiple facilities practiced blanket tossing, where prisoners were thrown high in the air using a blanket, often landing on hard ground or in their own waste. Sergeant Major Robert H. Kellogg described how one prisoner at Andersonville was tossed so high he broke his neck upon landing, to the guards' amusement. Weather became a weapon of torture in itself. At Andersonville, where temperatures regularly exceeded 40 degrees, prisoners called the open compound God's frying pan. Private Prescott Tracy recorded 140 heat-related deaths in a single week of August 1864. At northern prisons like Johnson's Island in Ohio, Confederate Captain Robert E. Park documented how prisoners would huddle together in groups of 5 or 6, sharing single blankets in desperate attempts to survive temperatures that dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Prisoners at Rock Island Prison in Illinois were forced to break through ice to obtain drinking water, with several drowning in the attempt. One guard, Private James Thompson, wrote home, "The rebels' screams as they break through the ice are a daily symphony." The level of desperation led to bizarre survival strategies. At Camp Morton in Indiana, Confederate prisoners formed what they called life insurance companies, groups of 6 to 8 men who would share everything, believing their chances of survival increased through cooperation. Private Thomas Spooner documented how his group survived by taking turns sleeping while others hunted rats and insects. At Elmira, prisoners began eating bark from the few trees in the compound, leading to the complete debarking of every tree within reach. Some prisoners at various camps would purposely wound themselves, hoping to be sent to better-equipped hospital facilities. When liberation finally came, many prisoners were too weak to celebrate. Union soldiers liberating Andersonville in May 1865 found men who had become living skeletons, as Colonel George C. Gibbs described them. Private Robert Knox Sneeden, an artist who documented camp conditions, created haunting sketches of survivors who resembled walking corpses more than men. Similar scenes played out at northern camps, where Confederate prisoners had to be gradually reintroduced to normal food portions to prevent death from overfeeding. Dr. Valentine Mott, examining survivors, noted that many exhibited signs of permanent physical and psychological damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The psychological scars ran deeper than the physical ones. Many survivors developed what would now be recognized as PTSD. John Ransom, who survived Andersonville, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "The nightmares never left me. I still hear the cries of dying men in my sleep." Lieutenant James M. Page, who survived Elmira, noted that many former prisoners jumped at sudden noises and wept without provocation for years after their release. The trauma extended to the guards as well. Private Luther Hoffman, who served at Camp Douglas, died by his own hand in 1866, leaving a note that read, "The ghosts of those who died under my watch will not let me rest." The impact on families and communities was equally devastating. When Sergeant Major Robert H. Kellogg returned home to Connecticut after surviving Andersonville, his mother reportedly fainted upon seeing his emaciated condition. Communities struggled to reintegrate men who had been fundamentally changed by their experiences. Dr. Sanford B. Hunt, who studied prison camp survivors, reported that many exhibited a peculiar vacant stare and inability to focus on the present moment. The horrific conditions in these camps left an indelible mark on American history and military policy. Captain James M. Moore, who led the effort to document prison camp deaths, wrote in his final report, "The evidence of systematic cruelty is too overwhelming to ignore." His findings led to significant reforms in military prison protocols. The experiences of Civil War prison camps influenced the development of the First Geneva Convention in 1864, though the United States wouldn't ratify it until 1882. General William T. Sherman perhaps summed it up best when he wrote in his memoirs, "War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it, but even war should have limits, and what happened in those prison camps exceeded them all." In the decades following the war, survivors' accounts became crucial historical documents. Organizations like the Ex-Prisoners of War Association, formed in 1874, worked to preserve these testimonies. Samuel J. Gibson, who survived both Andersonville and Point Lookout, spent 30 years collecting stories from fellow survivors, creating what he called an archive of horror that remains a valuable resource for historians today. The last known survivor of a Civil War prison camp, Arnold Hutton, died in 1952, taking with him the final living memory of one of America's darkest chapters. Hunted Souls, the desperate flight of Civil War fugitives. In the tumultuous years of the American Civil War, two distinct groups of desperate individuals shared a common nightmare: the constant terror of being hunted. Frederick Douglass, who had escaped slavery years before the war, wrote, "The flight from bondage and the flight from battle shared the same heart, that of men seeking to reclaim their humanity." Runaway slaves and military deserters, though fleeing for different reasons, faced similar horrors in their quest for freedom, with both groups discovering that escape often meant trading one form of hell for another. Solomon Northup, before his own infamous capture into slavery, observed that the hunted man knows a terror that the hunter can never understand. Professional slave catchers, equipped with specialized bloodhounds and intimate knowledge of wilderness tracking, turned the pursuit of runaways into a grotesque science. The infamous Patty Cannon gang, operating along the Delaware-Maryland border, didn't just capture fugitives, they tortured them for information about other escapees. Operating from their headquarters at Johnson's Crossroads, they maintained a network of informants stretching from Philadelphia to Baltimore. Their methods included burning feet with hot irons to prevent future escape attempts, a practice that became known as Cannon's Mark. One survivor, William Parker, later wrote, "The sound of dogs in the distance would freeze the blood of even the bravest among us." The notorious Millard brothers of Georgia boasted of capturing over 300 runaways in a single year, using a specially bred line of Cuban bloodhounds they claimed could smell fear itself. Sarah Bradford, a contemporary chronicler, documented how the brothers would demonstrate their dogs' abilities at county fairs, using captured runaways as live bait in tracking exhibitions. Military deserters faced equally merciless pursuers. Confederate Home Guard units, tasked with capturing deserters, became notorious for their brutality. In North Carolina's Randolph County, militia captain James Brantley used what he called persuasive methods, holding deserters' families hostage until they surrendered. His Book of Persuasion, discovered after the war, detailed torture techniques and listed over 200 families he had terrorized. Union deserter hunters weren't much kinder, with Colonel Lafayette Baker's National Detective Police becoming feared for their ruthless efficiency and disregard for civil rights. Baker's agents were known to pose as civilians, even clergy, to gain information about deserters' whereabouts. Lieutenant David Homer Bates recorded how Baker's men once arrested an entire church congregation in Maryland, suspecting them of harboring deserters. The wilderness itself became both sanctuary and executioner. Runaway slaves followed the North Star through treacherous swamps, where many succumbed to exposure, starvation, or disease. Henry Bibb, who made several escape attempts, described eating tree bark and raw corn while hiding in Kentucky's dense forests. Freedom meant choosing between slow death by hunger or quick death if caught, he wrote in his memoirs. The Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia became known as the Graveyard of Hope, where local legends tell of over 300 fugitives perishing in a single year. Similarly, deserters often found themselves trapped between starvation and surrender. Private William Collins of the 4th Virginia Infantry recorded in his diary how he survived 3 weeks in the Appalachian Mountains by eating roots and raw snakes before finally surrendering. The famous Cave Dwellers of Tennessee, a group of over 40 deserters, created an underground network in Cumberland Mountains, living in caves for months until disease and hunger forced them out. The punishment for captured fugitives was designed to send a message. In Charleston, notorious slave trader Z.B. Oakes maintained what he called his correction facility, where recaptured slaves were subjected to systematic torture before being resold. Slave owners frequently staged public tortures of recaptured slaves. In Augusta, Georgia, plantation owner James Hammond ordered a recaptured slave named Tom to be whipped for 3 consecutive days, then had his ears cut off as a warning to others. The Richmond Examiner described these punishments in graphic detail, calling them necessary lessons in obedience. For military deserters, the spectacle of punishment was equally brutal. General Braxton Bragg ordered mass executions of deserters, forcing their former comrades to witness the shootings. At one such execution in 1863, 22 deserters from Tennessee regiments were shot simultaneously. Captain Robert Stiles described the scene. The volleys echoed through the hills like thunder, but the silence that followed was even louder. Some regions became notorious as killing grounds for both types of fugitives. The Great Dismal Swamp, straddling Virginia and North Carolina, harbored both runaway slaves and deserters, leading to the formation of specialized hunter units that patrolled its borders. Moses Grandy, a former slave, documented the existence of entire hidden communities in the swamp's interior, including the legendary African island, where fugitives maintained a permanent settlement. These swamp rangers were known for taking no prisoners, often shooting first and asking questions later. The infamous Captain Jesse Barton led a unit that claimed 76 kills in just 3 months of 1863. Confederate deserter James Keith wrote, "The swamp was where hope and death lived side by side. The area became so dangerous that even slave catchers would refuse to enter certain sections, particularly the region known as Dead Man's Land, where numerous bodies were found but never identified." The methods of tracking evolved into a sophisticated art. William Dog Bill Morrison, a notorious Mississippi slave catcher, developed a system of tracking based on Native American techniques, including a method of determining a fugitive's height and weight from their footprints. Slave catchers developed detailed systems for identifying foot patterns and estimating travel speeds. The infamous Nathan Bedford Forrest, before becoming a Confederate general, made his fortune as a slave catcher using innovative tracking techniques, including a network of paid informants in free black communities. His Manual of Pursuit, discovered in 1870, detailed methods still studied by modern tracking experts. For deserters, military police units employed local informants and maintained networks of spies in civilian communities. Union General Benjamin Butler established a system of photographing soldiers specifically to aid in identifying deserters, an early use of photography for law enforcement. The Butler Books, as they became known, contained over 2,000 photographs and detailed descriptions of potential deserters. Survival often depended on the help of others, but such assistance carried extreme risks. Harriet Tubman, the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad, developed an intricate code system using quilts and lantern signals to guide fugitives. The Underground Railroad, while offering hope to escaped slaves, brought severe punishment to those caught helping fugitives. In Virginia, Mary Maddox was publicly flogged and had her property confiscated for providing food to runaways. Her case became notorious when it was revealed she had helped over 30 slaves escape over 2 years. Similarly, families sheltering deserters faced harsh reprisals. The Crowder family of North Carolina maintained a hidden cellar that sheltered both runaway slaves and deserters until their discovery led to the execution of 3 family members. In Tennessee, the entire Carter family was burned out of their home for hiding their deserter son, with their youngest children barely escaping the flames. Their story was later documented by Union reporter Sylvanus Cadwallader as the price of mercy. The psychological toll of constant pursuit often proved as devastating as physical hardships. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a Confederate physician, documented what he called drapetomania, the supposed mental illness that caused slaves to flee. Deserter Elijah Brown of the 5th Alabama wrote about waking from nightmares of baying hounds, only to hear actual dogs in the distance. His diary, discovered in 1913, contains increasingly paranoid entries about being watched by trees and rocks. Escaped slave Nancy Green described in her testimony how she could never look at the moon the same way after spending months hiding from it, as its light meant death if spotted by patrol groups. She later became an advocate for former fugitives, establishing one of the first support groups for escaped slaves in Philadelphia. Some regions developed reputations as particularly dangerous for fugitives. The Cumberland Gap became known as Deserters' Death Valley due to the number of bodies found there, over 400 in 1864 alone, according to military records. The Carolina coastline earned the grim nickname the Slave Catcher's Shore for the efficiency of its patrol boats in intercepting water escapes. Captain William Tillman, who commanded one such patrol boat, boasted of capturing over 100 fugitives in a single month. Local newspapers often published accounts of captures and executions, with the Richmond Examiner taking particular delight in describing the justice delivered to both types of fugitives. Editor John Daniels' weekly column, The Hunter's Log, became infamous for its graphic descriptions of captures and punishments. The methods of execution reflected the society's desire for spectacle and warning. In Charleston, slave catchers would parade captured runaways through the streets, wearing signs describing their crimes, a practice documented by British journalist William Howard Russell as a carnival of cruelty. Slave catchers often returned captured runaways not just to their owners but through towns along the way, creating impromptu parades of human misery. Military authorities frequently staged deserter executions during dress parades, forcing entire regiments to witness their former comrades' final moments. The execution of 6 deserters from the 118th Pennsylvania Infantry became notorious when their commander ordered their bodies left hanging for 3 days as a warning. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman noted, "Fear must have its public face if it is to serve its purpose," though his own private letters revealed his disgust at such displays. The legacy of these hunts left permanent scars on American society. Former slave catcher Henry Bibb's deathbed confession in 1874 revealed the existence of organized hunting rings that continued operating well after the war's end. Several deserter hunters became prominent figures in the early Ku Klux Klan, applying their tracking and terrorizing skills to new targets. James L. Smith, a former fugitive who became a minister after the war, wrote in his 1881 autobiography, "The hunted never forget, and the hunters never truly stop hunting, they just find new prey." His words proved prophetic, as many of the techniques developed for hunting fugitives during the Civil War would later be employed in the enforcement of Jim Crow laws and the suppression of labor movements well into the 20th century. As Abraham Lincoln once said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present." And in this storm of war, only the luckiest and the strongest stood a chance. Thanks for watching, and if you made it this far, congratulations. You've already survived longer than most. See you in the next video. Goodbye.